The strange thing about dignity is that the people who have the least of everything else usually protect it the most. Ethan Calloway noticed the waitress because she never looked impressed. In Manhattan, that alone felt unnatural. The restaurant glowed with soft amber light and the low murmur of expensive conversations. Crystal glasses chimed softly beneath jazz piano drifting through hidden ceiling speakers while snow pressed itself against the windows outside like a silent audience. Men in tailored suits laughed too loudly. Women with diamond bracelets checked phones that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And moving quietly between all of them was Claire Bennett in a black apron and white button-up shirt that had been ironed carefully enough to hide how old it really was. Ethan watched her from table 12 while pretending to read a contract on his tablet. She moved differently from the other servers. No rushed panic. No fake smiles stretched too wide. Just calm efficiency. Controlled. Like someone who had learned long ago how to survive chaos without letting it touch her face. "Another bourbon, Mr. Calloway?" she asked softly as she reached his table. Her voice carried warmth without invitation. Ethan looked up briefly. Honey blonde hair, tied neatly back. Pale skin. Light freckles across her nose. Blue eyes that didn't linger long enough to flatter him. Most people looked at Ethan Calloway a second too long. They always did once they recognized him. Founder of Calloway Ventures. 42 years old. Worth nearly $4 billion. Financial magazines called him visionary. Business podcasts called him ruthless. His ex-wife once called him emotionally unavailable with exceptional taste in watches. But this waitress simply waited for his answer like he was any other tired man ordering another drink at 9:30 on a Thursday night. "Sure," he replied. "Keep the bottle nearby. It's been that kind of week." She gave a small nod. "Usually is in December." Then she disappeared again into the glow of the dining room before he could answer. Ethan leaned back slowly. Interesting. Across the room, a younger server accidentally dropped a fork near a customer. The man immediately snapped at her loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Unbelievable. Does this place hire anyone competent anymore? The girl looked barely 20. Her hands trembled as she apologized. Ethan barely reacted. Scenes like that happened every day in New York. Wealth created impatience the same way winter created ice. But Claire noticed. Of course she did. Ethan watched her walk over calmly and crouch beside the younger waitress for half a second. She whispered something no one else heard. The girl inhaled shakily, nodded once, and kept moving. Then Claire approached the angry customer with fresh silverware and a composure so effortless it almost embarrassed him. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir," she said gently. "Dessert will be complimentary tonight." The man's irritation dissolved instantly beneath the softness of her voice. Ethan frowned slightly, not because of the customer, because Claire never once looked humiliated while apologizing. Most service workers developed that look eventually, that invisible shrinking, that quiet surrender people adopted when their paycheck depended on swallowing disrespect. But not her. She spoke calmly like kindness was a choice instead of survival. 20 minutes later, she returned with his bourbon. Ethan noticed her hands were red from the cold, tiny cracks near her knuckles. She had probably walked to work. "You should wear gloves outside," he said absent-mindedly. Claire blinked once, surprised. "I usually do." "Usually?" "I gave mine away yesterday." Ethan looked up from his drink. "Why?" She adjusted the cocktail napkin slightly beside his glass. "Someone else needed them more." She said it casually. No performance. No attempt to sound noble. Then she turned away before he could respond. Ethan stared after her longer than necessary. Around 11, the restaurant began to thin out. Snow deepened outside, covering parked cars in white silence while exhausted taxi lights drifted through Manhattan like floating embers. Ethan signed the final page of his contract and reached for the leather check folder Claire had placed neatly beside him. Total bill, $384.16. He looked toward the window where Claire stood helping an elderly couple into their coats. She bent slightly to help the older woman wrap a scarf around her neck. Patient, gentle, unhurried despite the late hour. Ethan opened his wallet. Most people assumed generosity came naturally to wealthy men. It didn't. Generosity usually arrived tangled together with ego, guilt, loneliness, or power. Ethan understood that better than most. He slid a check across the folder and wrote the number carefully. $10,000. Enough to change someone's month. Maybe their year. He paused only briefly before adding a note beneath his signature. For whatever burden you're carrying. Merry Christmas. When Claire returned, he stood and buttoned his charcoal overcoat. You forgot to sign the merchant copy, she said politely. No, Ethan replied, nodding toward the folder. That's for you. She looked down. For the first time all evening, her expression shifted slightly. Not excitement, not gratitude, just stillness. Ethan recognized that kind of silence. It was the silence people made when life surprised them too suddenly. Mr. Calloway. Take it, he interrupted gently. Everybody needs help sometimes. Claire looked at him for a long moment beneath the amber restaurant lights while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. Then she closed the folder carefully with both hands. Good night, Mr. Calloway, she said softly. Nothing more. No tears. No dramatic thank you. No trembling voice. Just good night. Ethan walked out into the freezing Manhattan air, strangely satisfied with himself. Behind him, through the glowing restaurant windows, he could still see Claire standing alone beside table 12 holding the leather folder against her chest, while jazz music floated softly through the warm golden light. And for reasons he could not yet explain, that image stayed with him far longer than the $10,000 ever would. The envelope arrived at Ethan Calloway's penthouse just after 7 the next morning, while Manhattan was still wrapped in pale winter fog. It sat alone on the marble counter beside his untouched espresso, small and cream-colored with his name written across the front in careful handwriting. No return address. No stamp. Just Ethan. His housekeeper had assumed it was personal and left it beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Ethan loosened the knot of his tie slightly as he picked it up. He had slept barely 4 hours. International calls. Market concerns in Tokyo. A board member threatening to resign. The usual noise that came with running companies large enough to move entire neighborhoods with one decision. Yet somehow his mind kept drifting back to the quiet waitress with tired blue eyes and red hands. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was the check, untouched, folded carefully beside the restaurant receipt. For a moment Ethan simply stared at it. Then he unfolded the paper completely and saw the sentence written neatly across the back in dark blue ink. You saw my uniform. Not me. The city beyond the windows suddenly felt very far away. Ethan read the line again. Once. Twice. There was no anger in the handwriting. No bitterness. Somehow that made it worse. Most people would have thanked him. Some would have cried. Others would have asked for more. But this woman had returned $10,000 without hesitation and managed to make him feel small using only 6 words. Ethan walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the snow-covered park below. Tiny figures crossed the frozen pathways carrying coffee cups and scarves pulled tight against the wind. Somewhere beneath all that movement, millions of people were trying to survive another New York winter. Yet for the first time in years, Ethan realized he could not remember the last time someone had refused his help. His phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. Calloway, he answered automatically. Morning, said his assistant Rebecca. The Hartford acquisition meeting moved to 9:30. Also, Richard wants approval on the Boston expansion before noon. Ethan stayed quiet for a second too long. Mr. Calloway? Push Boston until tomorrow. Silence. Tomorrow. Rebecca sounded genuinely confused. Ethan almost laughed at that. Billionaires were apparently allowed exhaustion, but never hesitation. Did I stutter? No, sir. He rubbed his jaw slowly. Also, clear tonight after 7. You have the donor gala tonight. Ethan looked down again at the folded receipt in his hand. Not anymore. After the call ended, the penthouse became quiet again except for the distant hum of traffic 80 floors below. Ethan walked toward the fireplace and sat heavily in the leather chair facing the skyline. The check rested between his fingers like an accusation. You saw my uniform. Not me. The sentence kept echoing in his head because deep down he knew it was true. Ethan had spent most of his adult life solving problems with money. It was efficient, clean, predictable. A scholarship for the intern struggling with rent. A luxury watch for the executive after a difficult quarter. 6 figures donated anonymously after natural disasters. He told himself generosity mattered more than intention. But now, sitting alone in a penthouse larger than some hotels, he wondered whether he had slowly stopped seeing people altogether. Around noon, Ethan found himself standing outside the restaurant again. The lunch crowd had already started filling the dining room. Warm light spilled onto the sidewalk while snow melted into gray slush beneath expensive shoes and taxi tires. He almost turned around. This was absurd. He had billion-dollar negotiations waiting downtown, and instead he was thinking about a waitress who rejected his money. Still, he pushed open the door. The same jazz music floated softly through the restaurant. The same polished glasses reflected amber light across white tablecloths. But Claire was nowhere in sight. A young host recognized him instantly and hurried forward. "Mr. Calloway, welcome back." Ethan nodded once. "Is Claire working today?" The host hesitated. "Claire Bennett." "Yes." "No, sir. She only works evenings." Ethan slipped one hand into his coat pocket casually. "I see." Before he could leave, an older manager appeared from the back office carrying inventory sheets. "Mr. Calloway," the man said warmly. "Everything all right with your experience last night?" Ethan held up the envelope slightly. She returned the check. The manager's expression changed immediately, though not with surprise. More like recognition. "That sounds like Claire." Ethan frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" The manager adjusted his glasses carefully. "She does not like feeling pitted." Pitted. The word landed harder than Ethan expected. That was not pity. The manager gave a polite smile New Yorkers used when they knew arguing was pointless. "Of course." Ethan glanced around the restaurant again. Empty wine glasses. Soft piano music. Snow drifting quietly beyond the windows. Somehow the room felt different without Claire moving through it. Less grounded. Less real. "You know," the manager continued gently, "most people who come in here only notice uniforms. Claire notices people." Ethan looked back toward him slowly. "What does that mean?" The older man folded the inventory papers beneath his arm. 3 winters ago, one of our dishwashers lost his apartment during Christmas week. Nobody here knew. Claire figured it out because he stopped ordering coffee during breaks. Ethan stayed silent. "She paid for a motel room for him herself," the manager said quietly. "Never told anyone. We only found out because the motel owner came in later to thank her." Ethan looked down at the envelope in his hand again. Suddenly, $10,000 felt embarrassingly easy. That night, snow fell harder over Manhattan, turning the city quieter than usual. The sidewalks outside the restaurant shimmered beneath streetlights while cold wind pushed paper cups and taxi steam through narrow avenues like restless ghosts. Ethan Calloway sat alone in the back of a black SUV, watching the restaurant entrance through tinted windows. He had told himself he was only curious. Nothing more. But curiosity usually faded after a few hours. This feeling had followed him for 2 days. At exactly 10:43, Claire stepped outside wearing a long gray coat and a knitted scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. No umbrella. No dramatic rush. She simply breathed into her gloved hands once and started walking downtown through the falling snow. Ethan frowned slightly. No subway entrance nearby. No waiting car. She walked because she expected to. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Should I pull around, sir?" Ethan hesitated. "No. Just stay back." Claire moved through the city with the strange confidence of someone invisible. Past glowing storefronts. Past crowded bars spilling laughter onto sidewalks. Past couples hurrying beneath shared umbrellas. She never checked her phone. Never slowed down. Ethan watched her stop briefly outside a small convenience store where an older homeless man sat beneath the pharmacy awning wrapped in thin blankets. Claire disappeared inside for less than 3 minutes before returning with coffee and 2 plastic bags filled with groceries. She crouched beside the man carefully so he did not have to crane his neck upward while speaking to her. Ethan could not hear their conversation through the glass, but he saw the old man smile. Really smile. Claire touched his shoulder once before continuing down the block. No photographs. No social media post. No audience. Ethan leaned back slowly against the leather seat. "Jesus," he muttered quietly. 20 minutes later, Claire reached a narrow brick building near the East River. Not home. A hospital. Ethan stared upward at the glowing sign above the entrance. St. Mary's Oncology Center. The place looked older than most Manhattan hospitals. Smaller. Warmer somehow. Christmas lights still blinked faintly around the front doors despite it already being January. Claire disappeared inside, carrying nothing except her violin case, which Ethan realized she had been holding the entire walk. He blinked once. "A violin?" The driver shifted awkwardly. "Sir." Ethan looked toward the hospital entrance again. "Wait here." The lobby smelled faintly like disinfectant and coffee. Nurses moved quietly between elevators while soft piano music drifted from hidden speakers overhead. Ethan kept his coat collar raised as he walked deeper inside. Nobody recognized him here. Nobody cared who he was. A volunteer near the reception desk smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Ethan glanced toward the elevators. "I am looking for someone." Before she could answer, soft violin music floated down the hallway. Delicate, slow, almost fragile. Ethan turned instinctively toward the sound. At the end of a dim corridor overlooking the pediatric wing sat Claire Bennett beneath warm yellow lights. Alone, her violin rested gently against her shoulder while children inside nearby hospital rooms watched through partially opened doors. Ethan stood completely still. Claire played quietly enough that nurses could still work undisturbed. The melody moved softly through the hallway like candlelight. No performance, no applause, just music filling spaces where fear usually lived. One little boy in a wheelchair sat closest to her with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He could not have been older than 8. Claire paused between songs and smiled at him gently. "Too sleepy for one more?" she asked softly. The boy shook his head immediately. "One more." Claire laughed under her breath. "Tired, warm, real." Then she lifted the violin again. Ethan stayed hidden near the corner listening while snow drifted silently against the hospital windows outside. He suddenly remembered something his ex-wife once told him years ago during an argument in their kitchen. "You only know how to give people things, Ethan. You do not know how to sit beside them when they hurt." At the time, he dismissed it as bitterness. Standing there now, he realized she might have been right. Claire finished another song around midnight. The little boy clapped weakly beneath his blanket, while 2 exhausted nurses smiled nearby. Claire bowed dramatically enough to make him laugh before carefully packing away the violin. Ethan stepped backward instinctively before she noticed him. He did not understand why. Perhaps because suddenly he felt ashamed of being there. Ashamed that part of him expected to discover tragedy simple enough to solve with money. A sick parent, debt, addiction, something tangible, something fixable. But this woman did not move through the world like someone waiting to be rescued. She moved through it like someone trying quietly to rescue everyone else. Ethan remained near the elevators while Claire spoke briefly with one of the nurses. "You should really go home earlier sometimes," the nurse said gently. Claire smiled tiredly. "I know. You worked all evening first?" Claire nodded once. "Double shift." The nurse folded her arms. "And you are still giving away your paycheck?" Claire looked embarrassed now. "Megan." "Claire," the nurse whispered firmly. "You cannot keep paying for families here." Ethan froze. The hallway suddenly felt colder. Claire looked down briefly at the violin case in her hands. "Some of them have nowhere else to go. Neither do you at this rate." Claire smiled softly then. Not defensive, just calm. People survive longer when somebody stays kind to them. The nurse looked like she wanted to argue more, but instead sighed heavily and hugged her. Claire hugged back carefully before walking toward the elevators alone. Ethan stepped into the stairwell seconds before she reached the corner. His pulse felt strangely uneven. He stayed there listening to the elevator doors open and close again. Then silence. For a very long moment, Ethan stood alone beneath fluorescent hospital lights, staring at nothing while snow pressed softly against the narrow stairwell window. Somewhere deep beneath years of contracts and acquisitions and polished boardrooms, something inside him had started cracking quietly apart. The following Monday, Manhattan woke beneath freezing rain and a sky the color of steel. Ethan Callaway stood inside the 47th floor conference room of Callaway Ventures while executives argued over numbers projected across a massive screen. Someone was discussing expansion costs in Chicago. Someone else was worried about investor confidence. Usually, Ethan dominated rooms like this effortlessly. His attention moved faster than everyone else's. His instincts sharper. His decisions colder. But this morning, he barely heard them. His eyes remained fixed on the rain sliding down the glass walls behind the presentation screen, while one thought repeated itself over and over inside his head. People survive longer when somebody stays kind to them. Rebecca noticed first. She always did. His assistant leaned toward him carefully during a pause in the meeting. "You are staring at weather like it insulted you personally." Ethan blinked once and straightened slightly. "Am I? You have not interrupted anyone in 20 minutes. Frankly, it is unsettling." A few executives laughed nervously. Ethan rubbed his jaw slowly. "Continue," he said quietly. but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. 30 minutes later, he ended the meeting early without explanation. That alone caused visible confusion around the table. Ethan Calloway did not end meetings early. He extended them until people looked exhausted enough to surrender. Rebecca followed him out into the hallway, carrying her tablet. "All right," she said carefully once the elevator doors closed behind them. "Who is she?" Ethan looked over immediately. "Excuse me." There is always a reason powerful men suddenly start staring out windows like tragic novel characters. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. "You spend too much time online, and you are avoiding the question." The elevator descended silently through mirrored walls and soft music. Ethan stared ahead. "There is a waitress." Rebecca's eyebrows lifted instantly. "A waitress? It is not like that." That sentence usually means it is exactly like that. Ethan exhaled quietly. She returned $10,000. Rebecca stopped walking the moment the elevator opened into the lobby. "I am sorry." Returned. Ethan nodded once. Then she spent her night playing violin for children at an oncology center instead of sleeping. Rebecca stared at him now with genuine interest. Well, what? That explains the existential crisis face. Ethan shook his head slightly and stepped into the rainy street, where black umbrellas moved like shadows through traffic noise and steam rising from subway grates. "I do not understand her." Rebecca walked beside him carefully beneath the awning. "Maybe that is because you are used to people needing something from you." Ethan said nothing, because unfortunately she was right. That evening, Ethan returned to the restaurant again. He told himself he only wanted clarity. Closure perhaps. Yet when Claire appeared from the kitchen carrying 2 plates balanced carefully against one arm, something inside him eased unexpectedly. She noticed him immediately, but showed no visible surprise. "Good evening, Mr. Calloway," she said calmly as she approached the table. "Back again already?" Ethan studied her face beneath the warm amber lights. She looked tired tonight. Faint shadows beneath her eyes. Hair pulled back more loosely than usual. Yet she still moved with quiet steadiness through the crowded dining room. "I wanted dinner," he replied. Claire glanced briefly toward the nearly empty chair across from him. Most people who eat alone in Manhattan either want privacy or company. "Which one do I look like?" She considered him for half a second. "Tonight? Tired." Ethan let out a soft laugh before he could stop himself. Claire handed him a menu, though they both knew he would barely read it. "The salmon is good tonight," she said gently. "You say that like you personally interviewed the fish." A small smile touched her lips, then disappeared just as quickly. "I did. It had excellent communication skills." Ethan blinked once before laughing quietly again. The sound surprised both of them. Claire looked almost caught off guard hearing it. "You should do that more often," she said softly. "What?" "Laugh." Ethan looked down at the table briefly. "I am not usually given a reason." Claire tilted her head slightly. "That sounds expensive." He looked back up at her then. Really looked. Most people spoke to Ethan carefully, strategically, every sentence measured against his status or wealth. But Claire spoke to him like none of that mattered. Like she only responded to whatever existed beneath the suit. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. Claire rested the order pad lightly against her apron. "Depends. Why did you return the money?" Around them, silverware clinked softly beneath low jazz music while rain streaked the restaurant windows. Claire remained silent long enough that Ethan thought she might walk away entirely. Instead, she folded her hands lightly in front of her. "Do you really want the honest answer?" "Yes." She nodded once toward the dining room. Most people in places like this see kindness as a transaction. Ethan frowned slightly. "That is not fair." "Maybe not." Her voice stayed gentle. "But when someone rich gives something to someone struggling, there is usually an invisible expectation attached to it." "I expected nothing." Claire looked at him carefully then. Not accusing, just thoughtful. "You expected gratitude." Ethan opened his mouth immediately, then stopped. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Claire softened slightly, seeing the realization settle across his face. "There is nothing wrong with helping people, Mr. Calloway." "Ethan." She hesitated only briefly. "Ethan." Hearing his first name in her voice felt strangely human. "But sometimes," she continued quietly, "people need dignity more than rescue." The words landed somewhere deep beneath his ribs. Ethan looked around the restaurant, suddenly noticing things he normally ignored. The exhausted dishwasher disappearing through the kitchen doors. The older couple quietly splitting one dessert between them. the busboy rubbing sore wrists beside the coffee station. All this time he had moved through rooms calculating value, influence, efficiency. But Claire seemed to move through them, noticing loneliness instead. She reached for his empty water glass gently. "Are you ready to order?" Ethan looked up at her standing there beneath the soft golden lights, while rain pressed quietly against the windows behind her. For the first time in years, Ethan Calloway realized he did not actually know what hunger felt like anymore. Not for food. For something else entirely. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan Calloway developed a habit he could not explain to himself. He started showing up at the restaurant without reservations, always after 7, always pretending it was accidental. Sometimes he stayed for 20 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. He learned quickly that Claire Bennett treated every table exactly the same. Wealth never changed her tone. Fame never earned extra attention. She spoke to billionaires and exhausted tourists with the same quiet steadiness, as if human dignity should not fluctuate with income. That unsettled Ethan more than he cared to admit. One Thursday night, freezing wind rattled the restaurant windows while snow piled against the curbs outside. Claire placed a bowl of clam chowder in front of an elderly man eating alone near the back corner. Ethan noticed immediately that the man had not ordered soup. Claire leaned closer and whispered something that made the old man smile weakly before she walked away. 5 minutes later, Ethan called her over. "You gave him free food." Claire glanced toward the corner table briefly. He looked cold. "That is not exactly company policy." "Good thing I did not ask the company." Ethan studied her carefully. "You do that often?" She wiped condensation from a water glass slowly. "Do what?" "Take care of strangers like they belong to you." Claire looked genuinely confused by the question. "Everyone belongs to someone." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "You know, most people spend their entire lives trying not to get involved. Most people are tired." Her voice softened. "Loneliness makes people selfish sometimes." Ethan watched her move away toward another table while her words stayed behind like fog. "Loneliness makes people selfish." He thought about that sentence later that night, while standing inside his penthouse kitchen staring at an untouched dinner prepared by a private chef who knew exactly what temperature he preferred his steak. The apartment felt painfully silent despite its size. No music, no laughter, only the low hum of expensive appliances and distant traffic drifting through insulated glass. Ethan suddenly realized he could not remember the last meaningful conversation he had outside a boardroom. The next evening, he arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. Claire looked surprised to see him before the dinner rush. "You are becoming predictable," she said softly while setting down coffee. "That sounds dangerously close to criticism." Observation. Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "There is a difference." Claire gave the faintest smile. "Usually." Before he could respond, raised voices interrupted from across the dining room. A sharply dressed man in his 30s stood beside the hostess station arguing loudly with a young server whose eyes already looked close to tears. "I asked for sparkling water 15 minutes ago," the customer snapped. "This place is unbelievable." Ethan watched Claire cross the room immediately. Calm, grounded, like still water moving through noise. "Sir," she said gently, "I apologize for the delay." "I do not want apologies. I want competence." Claire nodded once. "You are right." Ethan expected tension, defensiveness perhaps. Instead, Claire simply listened while the man vented frustration sharp enough to embarrass nearby tables. When he finally stopped speaking, she asked quietly, "Rough day?" The question hit the man like unexpected sunlight. His anger faltered instantly. "What? You seem exhausted." The man exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. "My father is in surgery uptown." Claire's expression softened immediately. "I am sorry." Suddenly, the entire interaction changed. The man sat down slowly while Claire disappeared toward the kitchen. Minutes later, she returned not only with sparkling water, but also warm bread and a container of soup packed carefully to go. "The hospital cafeteria closes early," she explained gently. "You should eat something later." The man looked stunned. "I did not order this." "I know." For a second, his eyes became glassy with exhaustion. "Thank you." Claire only nodded once before walking away again. Ethan stared after her in silence. Most people responded to cruelty with ego. Claire responded with curiosity. She looked beneath behavior instead of reacting to it. An hour later, during a quieter moment between tables, Ethan finally asked the question that had been sitting inside him for days. "How do you do that?" Claire glanced up from polishing silverware. Do what? See people so clearly. She folded the cloth carefully before answering. Because most people are louder about pain than kindness. Ethan stayed quiet. Claire continued softly. If someone humiliates a stranger over sparkling water, usually it has very little to do with water. And what if they are just arrogant? Claire tilted her head slightly. Then life will punish them eventually, without my help. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. That sounds wiser than it should. My mother says suffering either softens people or sharpens them. There is usually no middle ground. Ethan looked at her more carefully then. Your mother sounds intelligent. Claire's eyes dropped briefly toward the silverware in her hands. She used to teach literature before she got sick. There it was again. A glimpse. Small fragments of the life Claire never volunteered freely. Ethan noticed she never spoke dramatically about hardship. Never performed struggle to gain sympathy. Even pain seemed treated carefully around her, as though she refused to let it become identity. And you? He asked quietly. What did you want before all this? Claire looked toward the snow falling beyond the windows. Music once. The violin. Her eyes flickered back toward him, surprised. Ethan realized too late what he had revealed. Silence settled instantly between them. Not hostile, just still. Claire studied him carefully now. You followed me. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it again, because there was no respectable explanation. Finally, he answered honestly. Yes. Claire stared at him for a long moment beneath the warm amber glow of the restaurant lights, while soft jazz drifted through the nearly empty room. Ethan expected anger. Disappointment, perhaps. Instead, she simply looked tired. You should not do that, Ethan. Her voice remained gentle. Somehow that hurt more than anger would have. I know. Claire nodded once and returned quietly to polishing silverware, while snow continued falling silently outside the windows. And, for the first time in years, Ethan Calloway felt deeply ashamed of the way he had mistaken fascination for understanding. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Ethan Calloway stopped going to the restaurant. Not because he lost interest, because Claire's disappointment followed him everywhere. It lingered in elevators and conference rooms, an expensive silence. You should not do that, Ethan. She had not sounded angry when she said it. That was the problem. Anger would have been easier to survive. Instead, she sounded tired, as if she expected better from him and regretted doing so immediately afterward. 3 days passed without him returning. Then 5. Manhattan moved forward the way it always did, indifferent to personal revelations. Snow turned to freezing rain. Christmas lights disappeared from storefronts. Business deals continued closing across polished tables, while taxis screamed through crowded intersections beneath gray winter skies. Ethan buried himself in work harder than usual. Earlier mornings, longer meetings, sharper decisions. Rebecca noticed immediately. You are becoming unbearable again, she informed him calmly one afternoon while handing over quarterly reports. Ethan barely looked up from his desk. That implies I stopped. You did. She crossed her arms lightly. For approximately 11 days. Ethan signed another document without reading it properly. Maybe I was tired. No, Rebecca studied him carefully. You looked human. Silence settled between them briefly. Then she placed another folder onto his desk and softened slightly. Did something happen? Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, overlooking the skyline. The office windows reflected rain and steel-colored clouds across Manhattan. I embarrassed someone. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. You embarrass people professionally every day. Not like this. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. I treated curiosity like entitlement. Rebecca sat down quietly across from him now. Oh. Ethan stared toward the city below. I keep thinking I understand people because I can solve problems for them. And maybe I have spent my whole life confusing usefulness with kindness. Rebecca remained silent because there was nothing casual to say after that. Later that evening, Ethan found himself walking alone through the Upper East Side, without security or drivers or schedules. Cold wind cut through the avenue while restaurants glowed warmly against the dark. Couples hurried past carrying grocery bags and coffee cups. Somewhere a saxophone player performed beneath a subway entrance for spare bills and half-listening tourists. Ethan stopped automatically outside St. Mary's Oncology Center. The hospital windows glowed softly against the freezing night. He had not planned to come here, yet somehow his feet brought him anyway. Inside, the lobby looked quieter than before. A volunteer adjusted flowers near the reception desk, while nurses moved through dim hallways carrying charts and paper cups. Ethan almost turned around until he heard familiar violin music drifting softly from upstairs. He closed his eyes briefly, then followed the sound. Claire sat near the pediatric wing again, though tonight she looked exhausted enough that even her posture seemed heavier. A little girl wearing fuzzy pink socks sat beside her on the floor coloring while listening quietly. Claire finished the final notes of the song and smiled gently. That one was your mother's favorite. The little girl nodded. She used to sing it in the car. Claire lowered the violin carefully. Then she had excellent taste. The girl giggled softly. Ethan stayed hidden near the hallway corner, listening while something painful tightened quietly inside his chest. He watched Claire help the little girl tape a drawing onto the hospital wall beside dozens of others. Crayon stars, handprints, crooked hearts. Tiny proof that people still tried to leave beauty behind even inside places built around fear. Claire. A nurse called gently from farther down the hall. Room 12 is asking for you again. Claire laughed softly under her breath. Tell Mr. Donnelly I already played Frank Sinatra twice this week. He says you play it better than Sinatra. Claire shook her head, smiling before standing slowly with one hand pressed briefly against her lower back. Ethan noticed immediately how tired she looked once she thought nobody important was watching. The nurse approached closer carrying paperwork. Did you eat today? Claire gave her a look. That is not technically your job. Answer the question. Claire sighed quietly. Half a bagel. The nurse frowned. Claire, I am fine. You donated grocery money again, did you not? Claire adjusted the violin case strap gently over her shoulder instead of answering, which was answer enough. Ethan felt something sink heavily inside him. Not admiration anymore. Something more uncomfortable. Shame perhaps. Because for the first time he understood the difference between generosity and sacrifice. Ethan had always given from abundance. Claire gave from absence. The nurse lowered her voice carefully. You cannot keep taking care of everyone else while ignoring yourself. Claire smiled softly then. Tired but sincere. Somebody once took care of my mother when we had nothing. That does not mean you owe the entire world forever. Claire looked toward the children's wing quietly. Maybe not. But I remember what it felt like when somebody stayed. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway while those words settled deep beneath all the armor he had spent decades building around himself. When somebody stayed. Not fix things. Not solve problems. Stayed. Claire eventually disappeared down another hallway carrying the violin case beside her like something fragile and familiar. Ethan remained where he was long after the music stopped. Long after nurses dimmed lights and parents fell asleep beside hospital beds. Somewhere around midnight, Ethan finally walked back outside into the freezing Manhattan air. Snow had started falling again in slow, silent pieces beneath the streetlights. For once he did not reach for his phone, did not check stock prices or emails or market alerts. He simply stood there breathing cold winter air while people rushed past him toward warm apartments and waiting lives. Then quietly, almost painfully, Ethan Calloway realized something he had never understood before. Claire Bennett was not changing because of him. He was changing because of her. The next time Ethan returned to the restaurant, nearly a week had passed. Manhattan had settled into the heavy gray rhythm of late January. Dirty snow clung to sidewalks in exhausted piles while cold rain tapped softly against taxi roofs and apartment windows across the city. Ethan entered quietly just after 8 wearing a dark wool coat dusted with melting snowflakes. Claire noticed him immediately from across the dining room. For one brief second, something unreadable crossed her face. Surprise perhaps. Relief maybe. Then her expression softened back into professional calm. She approached his table slowly carrying a coffee pot. You disappeared, she said gently while pouring coffee into his cup. Ethan looked up at her. I thought maybe you needed space. Claire placed the pot carefully onto the tray beneath her arm. Most people with your kind of money do not usually worry about boundaries. Ethan accepted the criticism without defense. I am trying to learn. That seemed to catch her off guard slightly. She studied him for a quiet moment beneath the warm restaurant lights. Something in his face must have looked different because her posture relaxed almost imperceptibly. How is your mother? Ethan asked softly. Claire blinked once. You remember that? You remember everybody. A faint smile touched her lips before disappearing again. She is stable this week. That sounds like a temporary word. Claire looked down briefly at the steaming coffee in his cup. Most hospital words are. Ethan nodded slowly. Neither spoke for several seconds. Around them, the restaurant hummed with low conversation and clinking silverware, while jazz drifted softly overhead. Outside, rain painted silver streaks across the windows. Finally, Claire broke the silence herself. You look tired. Ethan almost laughed. That is becoming your favorite observation. It keeps being accurate. He leaned back slightly in the booth. I have not slept much. Claire tilted her head gently. Work? Ethan looked at her for a moment before answering honestly. Thinking. That answer seemed to settle between them differently than before. Less guarded now. Less transactional. Claire folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. Thinking can be dangerous in New York. Why? Because the city is loud enough to distract people from themselves most of the time. Ethan stared quietly into his coffee. And what happens when it stops working? Claire glanced toward the rain outside. Usually that is when people finally notice they are lonely. The word landed harder than she intended. Ethan looked up slowly. Claire immediately seemed regretful for saying it aloud. I am sorry. That sounded harsher than I meant. No, Ethan replied quietly. It sounded true. She said nothing after that. Instead, she reached for his empty bread plate automatically. Ethan watched the small movement carefully. Claire, when was the last time someone took care of you? Her hand stopped briefly against the edge of the table. Not dramatic, barely noticeable, but Ethan saw it. Claire lowered her eyes toward the plate before answering softly. That is not really how life works. It should be. She gave a small tired smile. Maybe in movies. Before Ethan could respond, an older man near the front entrance suddenly began coughing heavily into a napkin while struggling to stand from his chair. Claire moved instantly. No hesitation. No panic. Just immediate calm. She guided the man gently back into his seat while speaking softly enough to steady him instead of embarrass him. Ethan watched her place one hand reassuringly on the man's shoulder while signaling discreetly for water. Slow breaths, she told him quietly. You are all right. The man's embarrassed wife apologized repeatedly while Claire reassured her with quiet patience. Within minutes, the situation eased completely. No scene. No attention drawn. Just kindness handled carefully enough to preserve dignity. Ethan stared after Claire as she returned to his table. You do that naturally. Claire frowned slightly. Do what? Make people feel safe. She looked genuinely surprised by the statement. Most people just need someone calm nearby. Ethan shook his head faintly. No. Most people need someone who sees them before they fall apart. Claire looked away immediately then, almost uncomfortable with the sincerity in his voice. You should order dinner before the kitchen closes. Ethan smiled slightly. There you are. Where? Deflecting. That earned him another brief smile, despite herself. Occupational hazard. Ethan glanced toward the rain-soaked windows again. Do you ever regret it? Claire rested one hand lightly against the back of the booth. Regret what? Spending so much of yourself on strangers. For the first time all evening, Claire answered without hesitation. Never. Her voice stayed soft but certain. People remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you gave them. Ethan looked at her carefully then. At the tired blue eyes. The quiet steadiness. The woman who played violin for sick children after double shifts and still somehow apologized when she sounded too honest. Suddenly, he understood something that had been slowly changing inside him for weeks now. Claire Bennett did not move through the world trying to be important. She moved through it trying to be kind. And somehow, that made her more powerful than anyone he had ever met. You know, Ethan said quietly, I used to think strength looked like control. Claire tilted her head slightly. And now, he looked directly at her. Now I think maybe it looks like staying gentle in places that give you every reason not to. Claire went completely still for half a second. Then slowly, almost shyly, she looked down at the table. Outside the restaurant windows, rain continued falling over Manhattan while warm amber light wrapped softly around the two of them. And, for the first time since they met, neither of them seemed in a hurry to look away. By February, Ethan Calloway had started changing in ways nobody around him understood. It began quietly. Small things. He stopped taking private elevators and started walking through the main office floors every morning. He learned the security guards' names. He noticed when assistants looked exhausted after late meetings and sent them home early instead of praising overwork like a badge of honor. During board lunches, he asked interns to sit at the table instead of standing awkwardly against conference room walls pretending they did not exist. At first, everyone assumed it was temporary. A public relations phase perhaps. But then weeks passed, and the changes stayed. One afternoon, Rebecca entered Ethan's office holding a stack of reports against her chest. "You just approved paid medical leave for cafeteria employees." Ethan continued signing paperwork calmly. "Yes. Without legal threatening you first." He looked up briefly. "Should I apologize?" Rebecca studied him for a long second. "Honestly, it is a little terrifying." Ethan smiled faintly and returned to the documents. But the biggest change happened in silence. Ethan stopped trying to fix people. He listened more, interrupted less. Sometimes he simply sat with discomfort instead of immediately solving it with money. And every time he caught himself slipping back into old habits, he remembered Claire standing beneath warm restaurant lights, saying softly, "People need dignity more than rescue." One snowy evening near the end of the month, Ethan arrived at the restaurant carrying no phone in his hand for the first time since Claire had met him. She noticed immediately. "Did Wall Street collapse?" she asked while setting down water. "Not yet." "Then where is your second personality?" Ethan looked at the empty table beside him where his phone usually rested. "I left it in the car." Claire blinked once in genuine surprise. "Voluntarily. I am trying something new." "Dangerous." Ethan smiled quietly. "I have heard that before." The restaurant looked calmer tonight. Fewer customers. Softer music. Outside, snow drifted slowly beneath streetlights while passing taxis painted moving reflections across the windows. Claire sat briefly across from him during her break, wrapping cold hands around a cup of tea. Ethan noticed she looked thinner than before. More tired. "You are working too much again," he said gently. Claire stared into the steam rising from her cup. "My mother's medication changed." "Is she all right?" Claire nodded once. "Mostly. Some weeks are harder." Ethan hesitated carefully before speaking again. "Claire, if you ever need." She looked up immediately. Not angry, just knowing. Ethan stopped himself mid-sentence and exhaled softly. "Right." A small smile touched her lips. That was progress, actually. Ethan laughed under his breath. "I am evolving slowly. Most worthwhile things do." Silence settled comfortably between them for a moment while snow continued falling outside. Claire leaned back slightly in the booth. "You know what is strange?" "What?" "You look less lonely lately." The honesty of it caught Ethan off guard. He looked toward the window briefly before answering. "Maybe because somebody finally spoke to me like a person instead of a bank account." Claire's expression softened almost painfully. "That sounds sadder than you intended." "Probably." She studied him quietly then. "Money protects people from many things. Not loneliness." "No," her voice turned softer now. "Not that." Ethan looked at her carefully across the warm glow of the table lamp. "What about you?" Claire smiled faintly. "What about me? Who takes care of your loneliness?" She lowered her eyes toward the teacup in her hands. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. Then finally, almost too quietly to hear, "Music helps." Ethan remembered the hospital hallway. The children listening through cracked doors. The way Claire played violin like she was stitching warmth into broken spaces. "You stop talking about music like it still belongs to you," he said softly. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "Some dreams become expensive. That does not mean they stop mattering." She looked up at him, then with something fragile in her expression. "You really believe that?" "I think I am starting to." Before Claire could respond, her manager approached quickly from the kitchen, carrying an envelope. "Claire," he said gently, "this arrived for you earlier." She frowned slightly and accepted it. No stamp, no return address. Ethan noticed the change in her face the moment she opened it. Confusion first, then disbelief. Inside was a letter from St. Mary's Oncology Center informing her that an anonymous donor had funded 6 months of medication support for low-income families in her mother's treatment program. Claire stared silently at the paper while snow drifted softly beyond the restaurant windows. "Who would do this?" the manager whispered. Ethan looked away immediately toward the city outside. Claire slowly folded the letter back into the envelope and sat very still. Then after a long silence, she looked directly at Ethan. "Was this you?" Ethan met her eyes calmly. No, which was true. For once, he had not used his own name, influence, or direct control. He had only listened carefully enough to understand where kindness might actually matter. Claire studied him for another quiet moment, as though trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, she looked back down at the letter, her eyes shining faintly beneath the restaurant lights. "Whoever did it," she whispered softly. "They understood something important." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What is that?" Claire folded the envelope carefully against her chest. "Helping someone without making them feel small." Neither spoke after that. Outside, Manhattan continued moving beneath snow and sirens and cold winter light, while inside the small restaurant, Ethan Calloway realized something extraordinary had happened without him noticing. Somewhere along the way, Claire Bennett had taught him how to give without needing to be seen. Spring arrived quietly in Manhattan. Snow disappeared from sidewalks almost overnight, replaced by rain-soaked streets reflecting pale morning sunlight between rows of taxis and crowded coffee shops. Trees in Central Park slowly returned to color, while strangers loosened scarves and walked with lighter steps through the city. Some things changed loudly in New York. Others changed so softly people only noticed afterward. Ethan Calloway understood that now. 3 months earlier, his world had been built entirely around momentum. Meetings, numbers, acquisitions, every hour scheduled tightly enough to avoid silence. Now he found himself taking walks without purpose, eating dinner without checking emails, listening when people spoke instead of calculating what they needed from him. Rebecca nearly dropped her coffee one morning when Ethan canceled a shareholder dinner to attend an employee retirement party for a janitor who had worked in the building 31 years. "Who are you?" she asked flatly. "And what have you done with the terrifying billionaire I used to work for?" Ethan smiled slightly while adjusting his tie. Maybe he finally got tired. "No," Rebecca said carefully. "He finally got honest." That evening, Ethan walked into the restaurant carrying no coat despite the chilly April rain. Claire looked up from arranging silverware near the hostess stand and smiled before she could stop herself. A real smile this time, small but unguarded. Ethan noticed immediately. "There it is," he said softly as he approached. Claire tilted her head. "What? Proof you do know how to look happy." She laughed quietly under her breath. "Do not ruin the moment by narrating it." Ethan sat at his usual booth, while Claire brought coffee without asking. The restaurant looked warmer tonight somehow. Golden light reflected softly against polished glasses while old jazz drifted through hidden speakers above the ceiling. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows like distant applause. Claire slid into the seat across from him during her break, resting tired elbows lightly against the table. "My mother asked about you today," she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous." "She says any man who starts volunteering at pediatric hospitals after 40 probably has unresolved emotional issues." Ethan laughed softly. "Your mother and Rebecca would get along beautifully." Claire smiled into her coffee cup. She also said thank you. Ethan's expression softened immediately. "For what?" "For seeing people quietly." He looked down briefly at the steam rising from his coffee. "I learned that from someone else." Silence settled gently between them. Comfortable now. Familiar. The kind of silence that no longer demanded performance. Claire watched rain sliding down the restaurant windows while Ethan watched her. Not the way he had in the beginning. Not with curiosity sharpened by mystery. Softer now. More careful. He finally understood that admiration was not possession. It was attention without control. "You know," Claire said quietly, "you really did change." Ethan leaned back slightly. "That obvious? You listen differently now." He smiled faintly. "I did not realize people could hear that." People hear everything when they feel ignored long enough. Ethan stayed quiet after that because he knew exactly what she meant. Near the front entrance, an exhausted young mother struggled to calm a crying little boy while balancing grocery bags against one hip. Without hesitation, Claire stood up from the booth, walked over gently, and knelt beside the child. Ethan watched her speak softly enough that the boy slowly stopped crying. Then she disappeared into the kitchen before returning with 2 warm chocolate chip cookies wrapped neatly in a napkin. The mother looked close to tears from simple relief. Claire touched her arm gently before returning to the booth like it had cost her nothing at all. Ethan shook his head quietly. "You do not know how to stop, do you?" Claire looked genuinely confused. "Stop what?" "Caring." She considered the question seriously for a moment. "I think the world becomes colder every time somebody decides kindness is too exhausting." Ethan looked at her beneath the warm amber lights and realized she believed that completely. Not because life had been easy for her, because it had not. Claire Bennett stayed gentle despite the world, not because of it. And somehow that made her extraordinary. Later that night, after the restaurant closed, Claire walked Ethan toward the door while employees cleaned tables behind them. Rain still fell softly outside, turning the city silver beneath streetlights and passing headlights. Ethan paused beside the entrance. Claire, He looked at her carefully. Do you ever think about playing professionally again? Claire laughed softly. That dream sailed away years ago. Maybe. Ethan slipped a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to her carefully. Claire frowned slightly before opening it. Her eyes widened almost immediately. It was an invitation from the Manhattan Arts Foundation offering her a position in their spring community orchestra program. Flexible hours. Paid performances. Hospital outreach included. Claire looked up slowly. Ethan, I did not buy it, he said gently before she could misunderstand. I only told someone where to listen. Claire stared down at the paper again while emotion moved quietly across her face. Not shock, not disbelief. Something softer. Something almost painful in its hope. Why would you do this? She whispered. Ethan smiled then. Small. Honest. Because dreams matter. Rain drifted quietly through the open doorway while the city moved endlessly beyond them. Claire folded the invitation carefully against her chest. Then after a long silence, she stepped forward and hugged him softly. No drama. No performance. Just warmth and gratitude and exhaustion and trust wrapped quietly into one human moment beneath dim restaurant lights. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Not because he wanted more. Because for the first time in his life, something meaningful had happened without money standing in the center of it. When Claire finally stepped back, her eyes looked brighter somehow. Lighter. You know what is strange? She asked softly. What? Claire smiled through tired eyes while rain whispered against the windows behind them. You were the first person who ever tried to help me without making me feel broken. Ethan looked at her for a long moment beneath the warm Manhattan glow before answering quietly. That is because you never were. Outside, taxis rushed through wet streets while strangers hurried home beneath umbrellas and glowing storefronts. The city remained loud, restless, endless. But somewhere inside that noise, a billionaire had finally learned that the strongest people are often the quiet ones. And sometimes the greatest act of kindness is not saving someone at all. It is simply seeing them clearly before the world teaches them to disappear.